Let's talk a little bit about secondary data, determining what data you need, collecting that data, and then assessing that data. While primary and secondary data share many characteristics, there are some fundamental differences in how you collect and analyze secondary data. So let's talk a little bit about that. So of course, secondary data is data that is collected by someone else and typically for some other purpose. Why look at secondary data? Well, there's a lot more of it. It's faster because you don't have to collect it yourself and it's already collected. It's typically cheaper because you don't have to collect it yourself. And it oftentimes is longitudinal so that you can identify trends over time. So how do you carry out a secondary data analysis? Well, let's go through those steps. Step 1, you need to define the research topic. Of course, the first step in any data analytics project is to defining your goal or what it is that you're trying to determine. This is true regardless of the data you're working with. All right, so typically this involves defining a statement of purpose. As you recall in class, we had some examples of defining what the purpose of a secondary data discovery activity might be. And then we also then talked a little bit about what would the research design be. So that is, what are we trying to collect data for? Is it to solve a problem? Is it to determine an opportunity analysis? Is it to determine whether or not data that someone else has reported is accurate? And then, of course, the second aspect of this is then the research design. That is, how are we going to collect that data and where do we think it might be? Step 2, of course, would be to establish your statement of purpose. That is, before beginning any data analytic project or any data collection project, you should always clearly define what it is you're going to do with the data once you have collected it. Carrying out a secondary data analysis forces you to design your research process, okay? And that is, what types of data do you require, a list of potential sources that you might find that data, and then maybe some realistic expectations as to what data you might end up with when you're finished. A couple of years ago, we did a project for the Las Vegas Visitors Convention and Visitors Authority concerning Major League Baseball and the possibility of bringing the Oakland A's to Las Vegas as the Las Vegas A's. And we sat down and talked about what kinds of data we should be looking at to determine whether or not this was a viable and potentially highly beneficial activity for the Las Vegas Convention and Visitors Authority and Clark County, or whether it wasn't. And so we had to determine what kinds of data did we need to look at and where that data might actually be located, and have some realistic expectations in terms of what that data was going to look like once we collected it. Carrying out that secondary data analysis, of course, forces you to locate and collect your secondary data. And of course, the most difficult aspect of this is determining where the data is. This takes some practice. Many times, students are asked to carry out a secondary data analysis and they simply go in and Google a topic like Major League Baseball attendance. And if the data is not readily available, they say you can't get it. And of course, that's obviously not true. You need to practice and get good at trying to figure out where the data is located. And to some degree, this also, if you're using Google, for instance, understanding how Google works and what the algorithms are in Google to make that work. Step 4, you need to locate and collect your secondary data. Some of the places you might find it are in government statistics, technical reports, business journals, specific secondary data providers, and of course, we are going to look at some of those that are available through our library and typically simply online, such as the U.S. Census Bureau data, and some trade industry publications, and perhaps other online resources. There's all kinds of data out there. You just have to have a feeling and some practice in identifying where it is and actually collecting that data. Carrying out the secondary data analysis, evaluating your secondary data. All right, now I've collected some data and I want to go in and start analyzing that data. Well, the first thing I have to do is I need to review that data. Why? Well, to ensure that it's appropriate for my needs and to also understand its credibility or accuracy. In evaluating the secondary data set's relevancy, the question is, what was the original purpose of the data? That is, what was the data collected for? And of course, when and where was that data collected? That is, what was the source of that data? Where was it collected? And of course, when was it collected? Third, we'd like to know what data were collected and how was that data collected? Was it done with a survey? Was it done by estimation? Oftentimes with secondary data, some of the data is estimated from other sources. What questions were participants asked? If it was a survey, if it's other kind of data, we want to make sure that we understand what data do we have? Is it national data? Is it state data? Is it regional data? Is it global data? Is it data for the USA or North America or the Americas? So we do want to make sure that we understand the frame. And of course, finally, we want to talk about the form, shape, and structure of the data. That is, does the data really fit the questions that we need to answer using that data? And then, of course, we also want to assess that data's credibility or potential accuracy. That is, what are the credentials of those who carried out the original research? There are lots of data online that were collected by people who are not data collection experts. And then there is a question of bias in the data collection people. We see that when people who have a vested interest in the size of the data, for instance, being larger or smaller. While we one time got involved in a lawsuit with a number of different entities in Las Vegas in determining the actual population. One group of people wanted the population to be smaller, and another group of people wanted the population estimates to be larger. And of course, the question is not whether or not I want it to be smaller or larger, but what is the actual most likely and most accurate number. And then, of course, how consistent is this data with other sources? If you find some data and it is vastly different than other sources of the same kinds of data, then we need to question that data and go back and take a real hard look at how it was collected, who collected it, and when was it collected. So in summary, carrying out a meaningful secondary data analysis involves spending time and effort exploring where that data is located, collecting that data, and then, of course, reviewing that data to make sure that that data is the data that we need and that that data is reliable and accurate.